We're going to talk about every relevant quarterback and tight end for fantasy football, starting with the quarterback position. Tier 1, these are the guys you need to be going after in round 3, and if you got them, you should be very happy. Josh Allen. Now, I understand with Allen, yes, you have no Diggs, you have no Gabe Davis, but I've already showed that what we need to be looking forward to is Vegas Sportsbook's projections, because we understand that those are going to be more accurate than I can be, than you can be, than really anybody can be, because they have every little piece of information at their disposal. And right now, sportsbooks are projecting out the Buffalo Bills to be a top 5 scoring offense this year at number 5. And you go through and look over the past 4 seasons for Josh Allen. This is a quarterback that has averaged over 23 points per game. This is a quarterback that's had 390 fantasy points every single year. That's why I think you have to have him at 1, even if his wide receiver core is full of just questionable options, because even if his receivers are disappointing, he can lean on Kincaid, and he had 15 rushing touchdowns last year. Now, Jalen Hurts is another quarterback known to have some rushing touchdown volume, and people are putting it into question this year with the departure of Jason Kelce and the addition of Saquon Barkley in this offense. A lot of people worried that the tush push won't be there. Some people are excited with the change in offensive coordinator, think this is going to be a much better Eagles offense than they were a year ago. But I do want to take a step backwards and remind you that Jalen Hurts has averaged over 20 points per game for 3 straight seasons. And you go back to 2022, there Jalen Hurts averaged 25 points per game, which gave you a higher ceiling than any other quarterback we've seen over the past 3 years from a fantasy football perspective. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we're going to look at Lamar Jackson. Lamar's been hovering about 20 points per game over the past 3 years, but honestly, this may be the best situation that he's ever had. Now he gets Zay Flowers going into year 2. He should hopefully have a fully healthy Mark Andrews. And if you're looking at the rushing upside, I do want to remind you that it's going to be more important in a league where you only get 4 points per passing touchdown. If you only get 4 points per passing touchdown and 1 point per 25 passing yards, those quarterbacks that can go out and average 50 rushing yards per game like Lamar Jackson, have double-digit rushing touchdowns in an individual season, they are going to be able to have such a gap between them and the quarterbacks that actually lead the NFL in passing, such as Jared Goff and Tua Tagovailoa, that we'll talk about later on. Whereas if you're playing in a league where you get 6 points per passing touchdown, that's actually where the pocket passing options become a little more appealing, such as Patrick Mahomes. Now, obviously, Mahomes can run the ball. We see him in the playoffs doing it all the time, but he's actually averaged over 20 rushing yards per game over the past 3 years. That's not why you're drafting him, though. The reason you're drafting him is you think he can lead the NFL in passing touchdowns as well as passing yards. Now, he had a massive step backwards from 2022 to 2023 as the Chiefs decided, you know what, let's be a little more conservative. Let's run the ball. Let's lean on our defense, and let's just make sure Mahomes doesn't make any mistakes, and we'll win a Super Bowl that way. And obviously it did work out, but now you have the addition of Xavier Worthy, Hollywood Brown, Rashee Rice going into year 2, all in this offense. Hopefully this opens up the field. Hopefully we see more deep balls thrown for Patrick Mahomes this season. And if that does happen, you could see Mahomes get back to where he was in 2022, in 2021. So yeah, he was much worse than this last year from a fantasy football perspective, but I'm still standing by. I think he has that elite ceiling. Now, going over and looking at our next 2 quarterbacks, I'm flipping this. We are going to have CJ Stroud, then Anthony Richardson. Now, obviously, Richardson, he's the guy with the rushing upside. If you're looking for another quarterback to have 15 rushing touchdowns, if you're looking for a quarterback to average 50 rushing yards per game, Richardson's your guy, which is why if you're in high stakes drafts, like if you're drafting on Underdog, you will see Anthony Richardson goes rounds ahead of CJ Stroud. I don't know if I'm an idiot here. I don't know if I'm just overthinking this or not thinking about it enough. But my thought process is CJ Stroud was just the best rookie quarterback I've ever seen. Now you have Stephon Diggs coming into this offense. Nico Collins is still in his prime. Tank Dell is going into year 2. And it's not like Stroud's going to have 1-2 rushing yards per game with 0 rushing touchdowns. He's not Kirk Cousins. Now, obviously, he's not Lamar Jackson, but he is going to be able to pick you up maybe 15 rushing yards per game, 2 to 3 rushing touchdowns through the course of the entire season. But more importantly, I think that CJ Stroud can actually lead the NFL in passing touchdowns and passing yards, which is why I would recommend if you are drafting on Underdog Fantasy where CJ Stroud consistently falls to round 7, I think that's the platform to be targeting him on. And of course, if you are not already drafting on Underdog, it's It's the best place to get into an extra fantasy football draft this year because there's no time commitment at all during this season. It's how I draft hundreds of teams every year. It's how I won 150,000 on Underdog 2 years ago. And yeah, if you don't already have an account, you can find a link in the description, in the comment section. If you use code FLOCK, you're going to get my 2024 rankings, draft guide, and ADP consensus cheat sheet. Plus, with code FLOCK, you'll also get hooked up with a Christian McCaffrey special pick'em, more than less than half a total yard for week 1, and a Travis Kelce special pick'em, more than less than half a total yard for week 1 as well. So make sure you take advantage of that with the link in the description. Now, going over to our next quarterback, we are going to be looking at Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray arguably is the best weaponry that he has ever had in his career, with not only Trey McBride stepping into his prime, but also you're adding in Marvin Harrison Jr., which should open up the overall offense. Now, you go back to 2022, the season Kyler got hurt. 2023, Kyler coming off that torn ACL. So honestly, over the past 2 years, it is very difficult to evaluate Kyler Murray, but the last time we had him fully healthy through an entire season, he did average 21.5 points per game. So I don't know. I mean, if we go through and look at similar seasons as what Kyler Murray did from a per game perspective at 26 years old, you had Cam Newton in 2014, Donovan McNabb in 2001, Dante Culpepper, Cam Newton did it again, Aaron Brooks did it a couple times, Blake Bortles, and Colin Kaepernick. And the vast majority of these instances, the following year at 27, which Kyler's at right now, you actually have that quarterback averaging more than 20 points per game. Now, our next option will be Joe Burrow. With Burrow, I am operating under the assumption that Jamar Chase plays week 1. I mean, Chase was my first round pick in the Flock League, so I'm praying to God that Chase will play. But you have Chase, you have Higgins. If you are looking at sportsbooks, they are projecting out the Bengals to average almost 25 points per game this year, indicating that this Joe Burrow wrist injury isn't something that you should worry about. And there's really been nothing in training camp that shows that it should. Now, Jordan Love is our next guy. With Jordan Love, should be a very good offense. He's going to run the ball a little bit. He could potentially lead the NFL in passing. And obviously, the storyline you have in Green Bay is just the amount of weapons that he has. Now, obviously, he doesn't have a Jamar Chase level player. He doesn't have a Tyreek Hill level player. But you have Christian Watson. You have Jaden Reed. You have Romeo Doubs. You have Dontavian Wicks. You have Luke Musgrave. You have Tucker Kraft. You add in Josh Jacobs who can catch the ball. And all of a sudden, this looks like a Green Bay Packers room that is similar to what we've seen from the Kansas City Chiefs over the past few years, where you don't necessarily have that alpha wide receiver, but when you have so many guys that you're able to spread the ball around to, it can just open up the overall offense. And a lot of people are thinking that Love has MVP level upside this year. Now, going over to Dallas, Dak Prescott has a completely different situation, where you don't have a great wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4. No, you have arguably the best or one of the best wide receivers in the NFL with CeeDee Lamb. And beyond that, you have absolutely nothing. I want to say Brandon Cooks is washed. I don't think Jalen Tolbert's a great wide receiver 3. And for this reason, you're actually looking at an also offensive line situation. But anyway, you're looking at sportsbooks projecting the Dallas Cowboys from being the highest scoring offense in the NFL last year to taking a step backwards and still being a top 10 offense in total points scored, but not necessarily being that number 1 unit. Obviously, Dak Prescott has the same issues that you see with Joe Burrow, Jordan Love, CJ Stroud, and that you're not going to have a ton of rushing production. But unlike CJ Stroud, I find it hard to believe with this supporting cast that Dak Prescott can lead the NFL in passing and passing touchdowns. Now, once we get through the Burrow-Love Dak tier, I want to say this is about the range where you can roster 2 quarterbacks. If you draft Patrick Mahomes in round 4, you can't roster a backup QB. But if you took Dak Prescott as your QB1, I think you can take another one of these guys and just play the matchups from week to week perspective. Jaden Daniels is our next quarterback. I want to be on record. I have no idea if Jaden Daniels is going to be good. I mean, I'm an idiot. I can't, or I don't think really anybody on YouTube can consistently give you scouting reports from collegiate quarterbacks going into the NFL and tell you exactly what they're going to do, especially as a rookie. But what I do know with Jaden Daniels is, we can look back at LSU and see that he had 1,100 rushing yards last year. 1,100 rushing yards in college, where sacks account for negative rushing yardage. So absolutely insane. You're going over to a much worse situation where you go from Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. to Terry McLaurin, and God knows who the wide receiver 2 is here. I don't think Daniels is going to crush the world from like a real life perspective, but from a fantasy football perspective, if you're playing in a 4-point passing touchdown league, he has all the upside in the world as a rusher. Brock Purdy, a little bit opposite of this. Obviously, great news for Brock Purdy to actually end up getting Brandon Ayuk back in. And Purdy is one of my 2 quarterbacks in the Flock League. What I personally did in my league this year is I identified on the draft board that everybody was going quarterback early. I found some other values that I liked. So I waited to the last 2 rounds and I took Brock Purdy and Caleb Williams, and I plan on playing the matchups between these 2 guys. With Purdy, right now the Niners are projected out to be the highest scoring offense in the NFL. Great news that you have Ayuk. Great news that you have Debo, you have Kittle, you have CMC, and at the same time, they take a wide receiver in round 1 this year. So I think it's a really good supporting cast. And similarly with Caleb Williams, you have DJ Moore, you have Keenan Allen, you have Rome Odunze, right? And with Caleb Williams, the man had 10 rushing touchdowns last season. Now, obviously, the rushing yardage isn't necessarily there. He only averaged, I want to say, about 15 rushing yards per game. So I don't know how much he's going to run at the NFL level. I definitely don't think it's going to be up to the Jaden Daniels range, but I think that Caleb Williams should be a much better passer than the other rookie quarterbacks this year. And I think if you get any rushing, it's going to be a bonus. Now, going over to Tua, you're going to get 0 rushing touchdowns. He may not even average 5 rushing yards per game. But with Tua, he can lead the NFL in passing. I mean, look at what he did last season, but look at what he did last year and then understand he only had 15.9 fantasy points per game. So this is a massive, massive thing to talk about, in that if you don't have any rushing upside at all, where there's a big difference between, say, CJ Stroud having 4 to 5 rushing touchdowns and 15 rushing yards per game versus Tua having 0 rushing touchdowns and 4 rushing yards per game. There's a difference between there that is definitely meaningful. I think Tua is going to be a week-to-week player dependent on matchup if you can put him in. I'll say the same thing with Trevor Lawrence. Lawrence really has never been viable from a fantasy perspective. The best year you've seen from him, 17.5 points per game in 2022. And maybe it was just the ankle injury last year. Maybe Brian Thomas Jr., maybe Gabe Davis is exactly what he needs. But obviously you lose out on Calvin Ridley. I think you're playing him based off matchup. Jared Goff, Kirk Cousins, they're the same guy. They're going to be very similar to Tua, where you have absolutely nothing when it comes to rushing volume, but they can potentially lead the NFL in passing. If you're playing in a 6-point passing touchdown format, if you're playing in a league where you get 1 point per 20 passing yards, you actually should be targeting these high volume passers at a discount at the very end of your draft. But in the regular scoring format for quarterback, these guys are going to be more week to week plays based off matchup. Justin Herbert will be our next guy at QB 18. I've taken a ton of Justin Herbert in underdog drafts because it's best ball. You have to take 2 to 3 quarterbacks in every single one. And I think Herbert is a great QB2 to have. Now, I am a little bit worried that he missed so much time with the new coaching staff, with a brand new wide receiver core. I think that maybe the preseason was going to be very important for him, and it's kind of sad that we did not actually get to see any action there. But I don't know. I think Herbert is so much more talented than a lot of the quarterbacks that are ahead of him on this list. It's just a tough spot where I don't love the wide receiver core. It's a change with the coaching staff. They probably want to run the ball, and Herbert is banged up. Matthew Stafford will be our next guy. Stafford is obviously giving you 0 rushing. I don't necessarily think the passing volume can be to that same level as what you're going to expect with Tua and Goff. And honestly, the quarterbacks in this tier, I think it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to just leave them on the waiver wire. Like in the Flock League, I think Justin Herbert may have been the last pick. He may have been Mr. Irrelevant. Aaron Rodgers, Deshaun Watson will be our next 2 guys. Kind of streamers based off matchups. If everybody in your league rosters 2 quarterbacks, then maybe you go ahead, maybe you pick up Rodgers, Watson, just because it'd be hard to find anybody else off waivers. Now, let's go over to tight ends. If we are looking at tight end here, I think the clear strategy this year with how cheap the elite level options are is I am going after an elite tight end. I took Sam Laporta in round 4 of the Flock League. Sam Laporta goes in round 4 pretty much every single underdog draft as well. And this is a tight end that just put up the best rookie tight end season of all time. 2 yards per route run, 11.5 fantasy points per game, 5.1 receptions per game. Some people are worried that you're going to see overall touchdown regression, but I'm looking at the Detroit Lions saying Vegas is projecting this team to score the 2nd most points in the NFL. So I'm not as worried about touchdown regression as I would be with someone in a bad offense. So I'm fine going in on Laporta. Travis Kelce will be our next guy here. Kelce is 35. Obviously, you have a long track record. You have elite quarterback play. My thought process is, and this could be dumb, I know maybe we're not thinking about it enough, but Travis Kelce is a 35-year-old tight end. Sam Laporta was a rookie, and Sam Laporta scored more fantasy points last season. So with that in mind, I'm going to give the edge to Sam Laporta, but either one of these guys in round 4 would just be an absolute steal. I will say in the Flock League, Travis Kelce did go a full round before we took Sam Laporta though. Mark Andrews as our next option. Andrews got banged up last year. Was disappointing for a lot of people in their fantasy teams, but he has averaged over 10 points per game over the past 3 years. I know a lot of people think Isaiah Likely is some phenomenal tight end. The reality of this is I think a healthy Mark Andrews clears Likely, and he doesn't really have to worry about Likely taking any of those targets. I think this is a good Baltimore Ravens offense. I will point out one thing real quick. For the love of God, don't be handcuffing your tight end. Don't take Mark Andrews and then Isaiah Likely at the end of your fantasy draft. I'm looking at you, Joe, who's a developer of flockfantasy.com, and he's currently handcuffing Mark Andrews with Likely in the Flock League. But anyway, going over to Trey McBride, obviously in the second half of last season, McBride absolutely crushed as a year 2 breakout. Typically, that's the kind of guy you would want to be betting on over the declining veteran, or at least the veteran coming off an injury, such as Mark Andrews. But my hesitation is Harrison coming over. I think Marvin Harrison Jr. is a top-end wide receiver that is going to take a considerable amount of targets away from McBride. Still, I very much like McBride. Look at a ranking of him here. I'm just explaining why he's not the tight end 2 for us, because obviously, the man was at the very top of tight end finishes in the second half of last season. And then Kincaid will be our tight end at 5. Now, I am honestly, and I know this sounds dumb, I am maybe a little bit more worried about Dawson Knox taking touchdowns from Kincaid than I am Isaiah Likely taking touchdowns from Mark Andrews. That's why I'm going to have Kincaid at the bottom of this tier. I've been drafting a ton of Dalton Kincaid in round 5, though, because he could potentially lead the Buffalo Bills in targets. Like I discussed at the beginning of this video, I do think that this is a situation where Buffalo is maybe being a little bit disrespected by the fantasy football community in particular, where when you're looking at sports books, they are projecting this offense to still be inside the top 5. So there should be a ton of points scored, where it's not necessarily like wide receivers are just dominant here. I'm rooting for Keon, but we don't know. Now, our next guy will be Kyle Pitts. This tier between Pitts and Kittle, I think really could have been shooken up if you would have had Brandon Ayuk dealt. But with Ayuk staying in San Fran, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt to Kyle Pitts. I want to be very transparent with you. I drafted a lot of Kyle Pitts last year. Kyle Pitts completely burned me. Am I drafting a lot of Kyle Pitts this season? I haven't been. The main reason is you can get Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid at the beginning of the 5th. Kyle Pitts goes at the end of the 5th, the beginning of the 6th. So I would rather just pay a little bit of a higher price tag on the tight ends a tier above here, rather than just waiting one round and taking Pitts later. And then George Kittle will be our next guy. Kittle, I know it seemed like maybe he was disappointing at times last season, didn't do much in the real life playoffs, didn't matter for you. But anyway, he still averaged 2.5 yards per route run. He still averaged 4.1 receptions per game. Now, of course, the issue is you have IU, you have Debo, you have CMC. They take a wide receiver round 1. George Kittle is 31 years old. So he's a declining tight end that's in an offense where you have a ton of competition. But if we look at tight ends that had a similar age 30 season to George Kittle since the year 2000, you had Delaney Walker, Tony Gonzalez, Owen Daniels, Greg Olsen, Jimmy Graham, Heath Miller. And more times than not, the tight ends the following year average about 13 points per game in a full PPR format. Now, Evan Ingram will be our next option. Evan Ingram was at the very top of the NFL in volume last year, averaging 6.7 receptions per game. So if you think that this volume is going to maintain for Evan Ingram, specifically in a full PPR format, I think you could very easily move in the tier above this. Because in a full PPR league, if you get those cheap receptions, then it doesn't really matter if you have touchdown equity or not. You're still going to be viable. But there's also that outside chance that Evan Ingram ends up not only getting the same target volume that he had last year, but all of a sudden you actually get the touchdown volatility swing in the favor of Evan Ingram. And if that were to occur, obviously just absolutely crushes. To be honest with you, I don't think Jake Ferguson's that good. Jake Ferguson, 1.5 yards per route run last year. But at the same time, Jake Ferguson is a younger tight end, only going to be 25 years old this next season. And as I discussed previously, outside of CeeDee Lamb, I'm not a big Brandon Cooks guy this year. Brandon Cooks was at 1.3 yards per route run last season. I don't think Jalen Tolbert is that good of a wide receiver 3 at the NFL level. So I think Ferguson's in a high-scoring offense where the weapons behind CeeDee Lamb are extremely limited, where Lamb missed out on a decent amount of training camp reps, where maybe Jake Ferguson is going to be involved in the red zone here more than you would typically expect. So I'm completely fine taking a ton of Ferguson because I think he's in a phenomenal situation, even if I don't think he's an elite talent. Now, our next guy will be David Njoku. With Njoku, I think he's great. He was much better with Joe Flacco under center last year than Deshaun Watson. Obviously, there's just a lot more passing volume in this offense with Flacco. But if you think Watson can get back to anything like he was in Houston, there's a ton of upside here. Brock Bowers looked great in the preseason. The Raiders went out and they said, okay, yeah, we're going to get this guy involved every way that we can. He's already been cleared to go week 1. Obviously, he was dealing with an injury earlier, but you saw him actually have 5 rushing touchdowns at Georgia. He is an extremely dynamic tight end. The Raiders have already showed that they're going to use him all over the football field, even though he is a rookie. But I think, honestly, we should expect him to maybe start a little slower. Like, if I drafted Bowers as my tight end 1, I'd definitely be looking for another one of these tight ends because you may have to start him at the beginning of the year. But I think Bowers could be a very interesting buy low candidate if he doesn't do much in the first month of the season because he is a rookie tight end. Our next guy will be Dallas Goedert. Now, Dallas Goedert technically didn't drop in these rankings with the addition of Jahan Dotson, but I am definitely less excited about Dallas Goedert. Dotson coming over possibly gives Philadelphia a viable wide receiver 3, and this potentially eats into the target share that you'd expect for Goedert. Dallas Goedert has climbed for 3 straight seasons from 2.6 to 2.1 to 1.5 yards per route run. But if you think that this offensive coordinator change is actually going to boost the Philadelphia Eagles passing volume, then obviously you'd be more excited about him than this ranking. Dalton Schultz will be our next guy. There are just so many targets here where you have to go against Diggs, Nico, Dell. Yes, I think it's going to be an elite offense. I don't think Schultz is an elite talent. He is 28. And ultimately, I just don't know how many targets you can command when, if I'm CJ Stroud, every chance I get, I'm getting the ball in the hand of Stephon Diggs. I'm getting the ball in the hands of Nico Collins. I don't know how often I'm looking at Schultz outside of last resort. Pat Freiermuth will be our next guy. If you're looking at Freiermuth, the injury to Roman Wilson really just clears it up where there's nobody else outside of George Pickens here to really command any type of respectable target share. So I definitely think if you wanted to go like 2 tight ends, if you're going to wait till the very end of your draft, go like Dallas Goedert, Pat Freiermuth, pair these 2 guys together, or Taysom Hill here at 15. Now with Taysom Hill, I want to be very clear with you. This is not a tight end that you should ignore in a non-PPR format. In a non-PPR format where touchdowns are everything, Taysom Hill jumps Freiermuth. He jumps Schultz. He jumps Goddard. He is up there alongside David Njoku and Brock Bowers. Now, in a full PPR league, obviously, we're expecting some of these other guys to have more targets, even if we expect Taysom to come away with the touchdowns. Now, our next guy will be TJ Hawkinson. With TJ Hawkinson, only take him if you have an IR slot you can throw him on. Obviously, he's missing the first 4 weeks. It's going to be a tough situation coming into this offense where you have Darnold under center, you have Jefferson, you have Addison, so a ton of target competition. I just do want to be very clear with the TJ Hawkinson pick that he's a good backup if you can throw him on the IR, but if you're going to have to put him on your bench, he's going to really limit the waiver wire moves that you can make. And then Luke Musgrave is our next guy at 17. Honestly, Musgrave, Kmet, Hunter Henry, and Cade Otton, I think these tight ends should most likely be on your waiver wire. The only reason I'm even bringing them up is if the vast majority of your other league mates are rostering a backup tight ends and your tight end 1 is like Dallas Goedert, then maybe at that point it does make sense to go ahead, get that backup tight end just because you don't want to be taking absolute zeros if anything does happen to your starter. But I think that's all I got for you. I really hope that we were able to help you out here. And of course, I'm going to be drafting every single night on the live stream on this channel. So if you want to draft against me, you can find that link to Underdog Fantasy in the description, in the comment section. Like I said, Underdog's the best spot to get into an extra fantasy football draft this year because there's no time commitment at all during the year because it's best ball. So I draft 100 teams every year. So I won 150,000 over there 2 years ago. And if you use code FLOCK, you're going to get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. My rankings, draft guide, and ADP consensus cheat sheet, plus a Christian McCaffrey special pick'em more than less than half a total yard, and a Travis Kelce special pick'em more than less than half a total yard for week 1 as well. But I think that's all I got for you. Really do appreciate you. Really, you have a great day, and hope I get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.